Every nurse on the floor knew one rule above all others. Do not touch Choi Tae-yoon, do not look at him too long, and under no circumstances make him feel anything, because the last person who tried ended up reassigned to a clinic in the middle of nowhere with no explanation and no appeal. Adaeze had been in Seoul for exactly 9 days when she grabbed his collar, looked him dead in his terrifying beautiful face, and told him he was wrong. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. And Choi Tae-yoon, the most feared CEO in Korean medical history, looked at this woman like she had just done something to him that 15 years of power and isolation had made completely impossible, and he had absolutely no idea how to survive it. Welcome to Afro-Korean Wave, besties. Please like, share and subscribe. Adaeze Obi arrived in Seoul on a Tuesday morning in March with 2 suitcases, a nursing license that had cost her more than she liked to calculate, and the specific kind of courage that came not from the absence of fear but from having decided, somewhere over the Arabian Sea at 35,000 feet, that she was done letting fear make her decisions. She was 28 years old, born in Enugu in southeastern Nigeria, trained in Lagos, and she had applied for the International Nursing Exchange Program at Taesung Medical Group on something between a dare and a prayer, never genuinely believing she would be selected, and then she had been selected, and now here she was, standing outside one of the most prestigious private hospitals in South Korea with her biggest suitcase listing to the left because one wheel had broken somewhere over Dubai. She fixed the suitcase by lifting it slightly and rolling it at an angle, which was not elegant but was functional, and she walked through the front doors of Taesung Medical Group's flagship building with her head up. The hospital was enormous and immaculate and deeply intimidating in the way of places that had been designed to make ordinary people feel the specific weight of their ordinariness. 44 floors of glass and steel and the kind of hush that institutional money purchased by eliminating every sound that was not purposeful. The lobby alone was larger than the entire ground floor of the last hospital she had worked in. She stood at the reception desk and gave her name and was processed with the efficient courtesy of a facility that handled important people daily and had extended that courtesy as a matter of policy to everyone else. She was assigned to the executive medical wing on the 38th floor. Her supervising nurse, a small precise Korean woman named Nurse Han, met her at the elevator with the expression of someone who had been briefed on her arrival and had several thoughts about it that she was professionally suppressing. You will find, Nurse Han said as they walked the corridor together, that this floor operates differently from any other clinical environment you have previously worked in. The patients here are high-profile individuals with specific privacy requirements. The protocols are exacting. The standards are absolute. She paused at the nurse's station and turned to look at Adaeze directly. And the director, she said, with a particular weight on the word, has final authority over all clinical decisions on this floor. His word is the last word. Do you understand? Adaeze understood. She spent the first 3 days learning the floor the way she learned everything, with total attention and zero performance of confidence she did not yet have. She studied the protocols, memorized the layout, introduced herself to every member of the team with the directness her mother had always called her greatest quality and her most reliable source of trouble. The staff received her with varying degrees of warmth, from genuine welcome to polite reserve to the careful neutrality of people who had not yet decided what category she belonged in. She had been in rooms like this before. Different country, different language, same human architecture. She was patient. She was good at her job. The rest would follow. On the 4th day she encountered Choi Tae-yoon, and patient became a significantly more complicated concept. She had heard about him before she saw him, which was how it always worked on this floor. 3 different nurses had mentioned him in her first week, each time with the same combination of professional deference and personal wariness, the way people spoke about weather systems that had proven themselves capable of serious damage. The CEO of Taesung Medical Group. The man who had inherited the hospital group from his father at 31 and turned it from a respected institution into the most profitable private medical network in South Korea in 4 years. Brilliant, ruthless, exacting, and possessed of a personality that one of the younger nurses had described, in a whisper over lunch, as basically a human blizzard. Cold. Precise. Impossible to argue with and devastating if you were standing in the wrong place when he arrived. Adaeze had filed all of this under useful context and returned to her patients. She was in the middle of a medication review on the morning of day 4 when she heard the elevator. She did not look up. She was reading a dosage chart for a patient in room 3809 and there was something in it that had been bothering her since she picked it up, a calculation that sat slightly wrong at the back of her clinical instinct. The way a note played slightly flat sat wrong in the ear of someone with perfect pitch. She was still working through it when the temperature on the floor changed. She registered it peripherally. The specific quality of collective attention shifting. The straightening of spines. The sudden purposefulness of people who had been moving at a normal pace and had now, without any visible signal, accelerated slightly. She heard Nurse Han's voice, crisp and welcoming, and a response in a male voice that was low and even and carried the absolute absence of any need to project. The voice of someone who had never in his life needed to speak louder to be heard. She looked up. Choi Tae-yoon was walking down the corridor toward the nurse's station with two people she recognized as senior administrators flanking him at a respectful half-step behind, and the photographs she had found when she had, of course, looked him up, had been accurate in their facts and entirely inadequate in their effect. He was tall, lean and broad through the shoulders with the build of someone whose body was a tool he maintained with the same precision he applied to everything else. His face was all sharp architecture, high cheekbones above a defined jaw, a straight elegant nose, and eyes that were dark and deep and scanning the corridor with an attention that catalogued everything it touched. His hair was thick and black and swept back from his forehead with no particular effort, the way things that were naturally striking did not need to be arranged. He was wearing a black suit that fit him like it had been constructed around him specifically, with a white shirt and no tie, the collar open at the base of his throat. He was, objectively, one of the most physically commanding people she had ever seen. He was also, based on everything she had heard, a man who operated the floor she worked on as if it were an extension of his personal authority, which was something she had filed under things to navigate carefully. His eyes swept the station and landed on her for approximately 2 seconds with the impersonal precision of someone taking inventory, and then moved on, and he continued walking, and the corridor continued breathing around him. Adaeze looked back at her chart. The number was still wrong. She spent another 4 minutes confirming it, cross-referencing the order against the patient's weight and renal function values and the standard dosing guidelines she had internalized thoroughly enough to use as a reference without looking them up. Then she set the chart down and picked it up again and read it one more time to be completely certain, because what she was looking at had been signed off by 2 senior physicians and the director's office, and suggesting it was incorrect was not a small thing. It was incorrect. She documented her assessment, flagged it with the attending physician, a young man named Dr. Shin, who confirmed her finding with the expression of someone who had just discovered a structural problem in a building he lived in, and then she made a decision that she would later describe to her mother, over an international phone call, as simply the only available option given the circumstances. She went to find Choi Tae-yoon. She found him in the corridor outside the cardiology consultation suite, surrounded by 3 physicians and an administrator, in the middle of a conversation that radiated the specific energy of a meeting that had not been scheduled and was not optional. She waited at a respectful distance until there was a pause, the kind that lasted 2 seconds in any normal conversation, and then she stepped forward. "Director Choi, I apologize for interrupting. I need to bring a clinical matter to your attention regarding the patient in 3809. Every person in the immediate vicinity went very still. Choi Tae-yoon turned to look at her with the unhurried, absolute attention of a man who was never caught off guard and was currently recalibrating something. She was new, she could see him registering that. The exchange nurse from the international program. He had clearly been briefed on her existence in the abstract but had not, until this moment, encountered it directly. His expression gave nothing away. "Speak," he said. "The current medication order contains a dosage that does not align with the patient's renal function values," she said, holding out the file she had brought. "I have documented my assessment and flagged the discrepancy. The attending physician has confirmed the concern. The order requires review before the next administration window, which is in 40 minutes. He took the file. He read it. Not the performing reading that people did when they needed to appear engaged, but actual reading, his eyes moving with the focused precision of someone processing information at speed. The 3 physicians around him were looking at various points in the middle distance with the studied neutrality of people who had decided they were not present for this moment. When he looked up, he looked at her, not at the file, not at the attending physician, at her. "You caught this today," he said. "I reviewed the chart this morning as part of my patient intake," she said. "Yes." A silence that had texture and weight. "The order will be corrected," he said. He handed the file to the administrator beside him. "See to it." Then he looked back at Adaeze with an expression she could not fully read, something that was not the impersonal inventory of his first glance but something more deliberate and more particular. "You are Nurse Obi." "Adaeze Obi," she confirmed. "Yes." He held her gaze for one moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he nodded once, with the minimal precision of a man who communicated in the smallest possible gestures, and turned back to the conversation she had interrupted. She returned to the nurse's station. Nurse Han was waiting for her with an expression that was entirely unreadable. The two nurses who were within earshot were either very busy or very convincingly pretending to be. Nobody said anything for a full 60 seconds. Then Nurse Han said quietly, "You had better be very good at your job, Nurse Obi." "I am," Adaeze said, and went to check on her patient. She did not know that Choi Tae-yoon stood in the corridor for a full 30 seconds after she walked away, looking at the space she had occupied, with an expression that none of his administrators had ever seen on his face and would not have been able to name if they had. The days that followed established a rhythm that was professionally smooth and personally complicated in ways Adaeze was careful not to examine too directly. She was excellent at her job in a way that became evident quickly enough that the initial wariness of the staff gave way to the more comfortable category of respect, and then to something warmer than that as people began to understand that she was not performing competence but simply embodying it, naturally and without theater. The patients responded to her with the particular trust that people extended to caregivers they felt genuinely seen by, and she gave each of them the same complete attention because that was how she had always worked, as if the person in front of her was the only person who needed anything. Choi Tae-yoon noticed. She became aware of this in the incremental way that awareness of being watched by someone precise and intelligent always arrived, not in a single moment but in an accumulation of small observations. The way the floor seemed to have advanced notice of his arrival on the days when he came to the clinical wing rather than remaining on the executive floors. The way she would look up from a chart to find him in a doorway or at the end of a corridor, not looking at her, or looking in her direction with the neutral expression of someone who might be looking at anything. The way he had begun, in the past week, to be present in the vicinity of wherever she was working with a frequency that exceeded any clinical rationale she could construct. She noted it and filed it and did not construct a narrative around it, because constructing narratives around insufficient data was not how she operated. The coffee appeared on the 9th day. She arrived for her shift at 6:45 in the morning to find a cup of the specific coffee she preferred, a blend she had mentioned to the administrative staff on her first day when she was filling out her preferences form and had subsequently found unavailable in the hospital's standard offerings, sitting on the counter of the nurse's station with her name written on it in handwriting she did not recognize. She looked at it. She looked around the station, which was occupied by the night shift nurse finishing her handover notes and not paying attention to anything else. She looked at the cup again. She drank the coffee because it was 6:45 in the morning and it was excellent. When Choi Tae-yoon came to the floor at 9, she was in the middle of a patient assessment and did not see him arrive. She saw him when she came out of the room and found him in the corridor, reviewing a tablet with his full attention, and she stopped in front of him because they were in the same corridor and stopping was more direct than navigating around him. He looked up. "The coffee was very good," she said. "Thank you." Something moved in his expression. Microscopic and controlled and entirely real. "You found it satisfactory," he said in the tone of someone making a note. "I found it excellent," she said. "Which you presumably already knew since you clearly know what I prefer." He held her gaze for a moment with the expression she was learning to read as the one that meant he was recalibrating. Then he said, "I make it my business to understand the requirements of my staff." "That is a very professional framing," she said pleasantly, and walked past him to the nurse's station. She did not see the expression that crossed his face after she passed, but the administrator walking 3 feet behind him did, and later that afternoon that administrator mentioned to a colleague that he had seen Director Choi almost smile, which was the kind of statement that required several minutes of collective processing before anyone present felt comfortable responding to it. The tension arrived, as tension always did, through a third party. His name was Dr. Lim Jae-suk, senior cardiologist, 36 years old, the kind of handsome that was aware of itself and had made its peace with that awareness. He had been friendly to Adaeze from her first week in the way that certain men were friendly, professionally on the surface and with an additional frequency and proximity that communicated something beyond professional. She had received it with the polite neutrality she applied to all situations she was not yet ready to categorize. On a Wednesday afternoon in her second week, Dr. Lim stopped by the nurse's station while she was completing charts and leaned against the counter in the posture of someone who had time to spare and wanted to spend it in her vicinity. "A group of us are going for dinner Friday," he said. "Nothing formal." He named a restaurant she had heard of, a good one. "You should come. You have been here 2 weeks and you have not seen anything of the city yet." She was formulating a response that was honest and complete when she became aware, with the peripheral precision she had developed over days of noting the specific quality of presence in a corridor, that someone had stopped moving to her left. She did not turn immediately. She finished the sentence she was constructing in her head, smoothed it into the polite decline she had decided on, delivered it to Dr. Lim with the directness that was simply how she communicated, and then turned her head. Choi Tae-yoon was standing at the corridor junction 8 feet away holding a tablet he had clearly stopped reading. He was not looking at Dr. Lim. He was looking at her, and his expression was performing perfect neutrality with the specific quality of something that was working very hard to stay exactly where it was. Their eyes met. She held his gaze for 2 seconds with the steadiness she brought to eye contact, then looked back at her charts. Dr. Lim, who had the social awareness to register that the atmosphere had shifted without quite identifying why, concluded the conversation gracefully and moved on. Adaeze finished her charts. Choi Tae-yoon continued down the corridor. But later that afternoon, when she was alone in the break room, her phone showed a new internal message from the director's office. It was a request, professionally worded with complete precision, for her to take on a secondary assignment. A specific patient. Long-term care management. Discretion required. She read it twice. Then she typed her response. Tell me about the patient. The response came in 4 minutes. His mother. She arrived at the private residence the following Saturday morning to find a woman named Choi Tae-yoon, 64 years old, a recent breast cancer diagnosis being managed privately for reasons that were explained to her by the attending physician in the careful language of families who understood that public knowledge of certain vulnerabilities could be weaponized. The woman was receiving excellent oncological care. What she needed additionally was someone who could provide consistent nursing support, monitor her response to treatment, and communicate clearly with her son about her actual condition rather than the edited version she was currently providing him. Because she minimizes, the attending physician said. She tells him what she calculates he can manage. Adaeze understood this. She had met mothers like this before. Choi Tae-yoon herself was a revelation. Small and slim with silver-streaked hair and eyes that were sharp and warm simultaneously, dressed with the precise elegance of a woman who had spent a lifetime in environments where appearance communicated things that words could not. She received Adaeze in the sitting room of her residence with the direct assessment of someone who did not believe in wasting time on performance. You are the nurse my son sent, she said. I am, Adaeze confirmed. He did not tell me you were from Africa. Nigeria, Adaeze said. Enugu specifically. Choi Tae-yoon looked at her with the evaluating expression of a woman who had made accurate judgments about people for 6 decades. Sit down, she said. Tell me what you actually know about managing treatment side effects, not the textbook version. Adaeze sat down and told her. An hour later they were still talking and the tea had been refilled twice and Choi Tae-yoon had the expression of a woman who had made a decision she was satisfied with. You will do, she said. And then, with a directness that reminded Adaeze strongly of her own mother, what do you think of my son? Adaeze looked at her without blinking. I think he is very effective at his job, she said. Choi Tae-yoon smiled with the patience of a woman who had heard careful answers before and was not confused by them. That is not what I asked. Adaeze said nothing. The older woman's smile deepened. He is difficult, she said conversationally. He has been difficult since he was 7 years old and decided that the best way to protect himself from the world was to make the world afraid of him before it could hurt him first. She looked at Adaeze with the warm, precise eyes of someone sharing information she considered important. He is also, underneath all of that architecture, the most genuinely good person I have ever known. But he has forgotten how to let people see that. Or perhaps, she added, with a look that Adaeze was not entirely comfortable with, he has simply not yet found a person worth the effort of remembering. Adaeze drove home through the Seoul afternoon thinking about that conversation in the particular way she thought about things she had not yet decided what to do with. She mentioned none of it on the floor the following Monday. She was professional and focused and excellent at her job, which was what she was there to be. She updated Choi Tae-yoon on his mother's condition in the clinical exchange they had established, standing in the corridor outside his office because he had not yet invited her inside it and she had not yet decided whether to push that, and she delivered the information with the completeness and honesty she had promised. His expression during these updates was the most unguarded version of him she had seen yet. The professional architecture thinned slightly when she spoke about his mother, not much, not enough that anyone who did not know what to look for would have seen it, but she knew what to look for now. She watched him process the parts of his mother's condition that his mother had been softening, the fatigue levels and the appetite disruption and the sleep patterns that were concerning enough that Adaeze had adjusted the care plan and wanted him to know why. She watched him absorb each piece of information with the focused stillness of a man who had trained himself never to react visibly to anything, and she watched the specific quality of that stillness when the information was about someone he loved. When she finished he was quiet for a moment. She told you she was fine, he said. Last week. On the phone. She tells you what she calculates you can manage, Adaeze said gently but without softening it further, because he deserved the truth and she had already decided she was not going to give him anything else. She is protecting you. It is what she does. But you need the real information to make real decisions, and I am going to make sure you have it. He looked at her with an expression that had no professional layer in it at all. Thank you, he said, and it was the most unornamented thing she had ever heard him say. She nodded and turned to go. Adaeze, he said. She turned back. He was standing in the corridor with his hands in his jacket pockets and the evening light from the window at the end of the hall catching the angles of his face, and he looked like a man who was standing at the edge of a sentence he had not yet decided to finish. My mother, he said finally, with the careful precision of a man choosing words like they cost something. She said you talked for a long time on Saturday. We did, Adaeze confirmed. What did you talk about? She studied his face, this controlled, complicated, quietly formidable man, and she thought about his mother's words, the most genuinely good person I have ever known, and she said, she told me about a 7-year-old boy who decided the world was safer if it was afraid of him. The silence that followed was the longest one they had shared. Something moved across his face, slow and deep and entirely unperformed. Then he said quietly, she talks too much. Adaeze smiled and turned and walked back toward the nurse's station, and she did not see him watch her go, but she felt it, the way you felt things that were specific and real and pointed directly at you. The following week delivered a complication that Adaeze had not fully anticipated in any of her careful internal accounting. She had understood, on some level, that Choi Tae-yoon noticing her was a thing that was happening. She had understood that the coffee and the sideways looks and the mother assignment and the corridor conversations were not the behavior of a man conducting routine staff relations. She had kept all of this in a category labeled things to be honest about but not acted on prematurely, because she was in a foreign country on a professional exchange and her life here was something she was building carefully and she was not going to compromise it for something she had not fully assessed. But then he walked into the room where she was treating a patient who had taken a fall, an elderly man named Mr. Beck who was in for a hip fracture and who had decided within 20 minutes of meeting Adaeze that she was his favorite person in the hospital, and he stayed. He had clinical reasons to be there. Mr. Beck was a significant enough figure that his care involved the director's awareness. But he had not come to the room before, and he came now, and he stood in the corner with his tablet and his professional composure, and Adaeze worked around his presence with the same focused competence she brought to everything while being entirely, precisely aware of where he was in the room at every moment. Mr. Beck, who was 81 years old and had clearly stopped editing himself for social comfort sometime in his 70s, looked from Adaeze to Choi Tae-yoon and back again and said, in the Korean that he had apparently decided she understood enough of by now, young man, you look at this nurse like she's the only light on in a very dark building. The room went quiet. Choi Tae-yoon's expression did not change. Adaeze kept her hands moving on the dressing she was applying and kept her face composed. I am conducting a clinical review, Choi Tae-yoon said with absolute evenness. Mr. Beck made a sound that was not agreement. Adaeze finished the dressing, checked the monitoring equipment, made her notes, and said goodbye to Mr. Beck with the warm directness she gave all her patients. She moved toward the door. Choi Tae-yoon was between her and the door, not quite blocking it but close enough that she had to pass near him, and she did, and as she passed he said her name quietly, just her name, and she stopped. She looked up at him in the small space between the door and the wall, and he was closer than the corridor had allowed before, and the light in the room was softer than the clinical brightness outside, and his expression was the unguarded one, fully and without any of the layers he usually maintained between himself and the world. He looked like a man who had run out of professional framings for something personal. The door, she said quietly, and he stepped aside and she walked out, and her heart was doing something entirely unprofessional for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, as she was gathering her things to leave, she found a small package on her bag. A box of the specific chocolates she had mentioned once, in passing, to the administrative assistant, as something she missed from home. They were Nigerian chocolates that were genuinely difficult to find in Seoul, and she had no idea how anyone had located them. There was no note. She stood in the break room holding the box and felt something settle in her chest that she had been keeping at arm's length for 2 weeks, something warm and specific and entirely directed at one person. And she thought about her mother's voice on the phone last Sunday saying, Adaeze, you have a tone when you say his name that you do not have when you say anyone else's name, and she had denied it and her mother had laughed. She put the chocolates in her bag and went home and did not deny it anymore, at least not to herself. Because the truth was simple even if the situation was not. She was falling for the most feared CEO in Korean medical history, a man who communicated primarily through precise language and carefully sourced gifts and the specific quality of his attention, and she had no idea whether what she was feeling was returned or imagined or something in between, and she was going to have to find out, because Adaeze Obi did not build things on foundations she had not tested. She was going to have to find out. But first, as it turned out, something was going to have to go terribly wrong. And on a Thursday night 3 days later it did. She was working the late shift when the call came. Not to the floor, to her personal phone, the number she had given the attending physician for his mother's care. It was after 11 and the voice on the other end was the housekeeper, not the physician, and the words were simple and devastating. Madam Choi has collapsed. We cannot reach Director Choi. You are the only number we had. Adaeze was already moving. She called Choi Tae-yoon from the car and he answered on the first ring, which told her he did not sleep the way ordinary people slept, and she gave him the information clearly and without softening it and heard the specific quality of silence that was not nothing but everything compressed into a very small space. I am 20 minutes away, he said. I'm 10, she said. I will be there first. She was. Choi Yunja had collapsed in the hallway outside her bedroom, a syncopal episode related to medication interaction that Adaeze recognized immediately and began managing with the equipment in her nursing bag and the absolute focused calm of someone who had been in clinical emergencies before and understood that calm was not the absence of urgency but the container that made urgency useful. She was on her knees on the floor of the hallway with Choi Yunja's head in her lap and her vitals stabilizing when Choi Tae-yoon arrived. She heard him come through the door. Heard the specific quality of his footsteps, controlled and fast. And then he was in the hallway and he saw his mother on the floor and she watched something happen in his face that no professional composure could contain. It was there for only a second before he locked it back down, but she saw it, the raw terror of a son, the thing underneath all the power and all the architecture. She is stable, Adaeze said immediately before he could speak, meeting his eyes directly across the space. Her vitals are returning to normal range. This was a medication interaction I should have caught earlier in the week and I did not catch it fast enough and I am sorry. She's going to be fine. He crossed the space and crouched down and took his mother's hand and the woman opened her eyes and looked at him and said, in a weak but recognizably dry tone, "You look terrible." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else and looked up at Adaeze over his mother's head with an expression that broke open something in her chest that she had been keeping carefully closed. They waited for the physician together. Choi Yunja was helped to her bed and assessed and declared stable and given adjusted instructions that Adaeze wrote out with the completeness she brought to all clinical documentation and delivered to the physician directly. The housekeeper made tea that nobody drank. The residence settled into the quiet of a crisis that had resolved before it became the worst version of itself. At 1 in the morning, Adaeze was in the hallway gathering her bag when she heard him behind her. She turned. He was standing in the dim hallway light with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbows and his hair not quite as perfect as it always was, and he looked like the version of him that existed when the performance had been stripped away by something that mattered more than it. He looked like a person. Just a person who had been frightened tonight and was still feeling the edges of it. You came immediately, he said. Of course, she said. You did not have to. She looked at him. Yes, I did, she said simply. He crossed the hallway in 4 steps and stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the specific quality of his eyes in the low light, and they were not the controlled, unreadable eyes of the Director General of anything, they were the eyes of someone who was done pretending that what he felt was something he could continue to file under professional context. He lifted his hand and touched her face with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable, his palm against her cheek, warm and certain, and she felt it everywhere. Adaeze, he said, and her name in his voice at that register, stripped of all the professional distance, was the most intimate thing she had heard in years. She covered his hand with hers. And then he kissed her. It was not tentative and it was not rushed, it was the kiss of a man who had made a decision completely and was honoring it fully, and she kissed him back with the directness that was simply who she was, and the hallway was quiet around them and the city was somewhere far outside and none of it was as loud as what was happening in her chest. When they separated he rested his forehead against hers and breathed, and she felt the specific quality of that breath, the releasing of something held too long. I do not know how to do this carefully, he said quietly. I have not done anything carefully in 15 years. Neither have I, she said. Not this kind of thing. He pulled back to look at her, and in his eyes was something she had been glimpsing for weeks from different angles and was now seeing in full, something enormous and certain and completely real. Then we will be reckless together, he said. And she laughed, genuinely, the kind of laugh that came from the place where relief and happiness occupied the same moment, and he looked at her laughing like it was something he wanted to keep looking at for a very long time. Outside, Seoul continued being Seoul, indifferent and luminous and entirely unaware that something had just changed irrevocably in a hallway in a private residence in its quieter quarter. But inside that hallway something had. The days that followed were the most privately luminous of Adaeze's life in Seoul, which she recognized as a dangerous thing to say given that they were also, objectively, the most professionally complicated. She went to work. She did her job with the same complete attention she always brought to it. She monitored Choi Yunja's recovery with the meticulous care of someone who had made a promise to herself about that particular patient and intended to keep it. She moved through the 38th floor of Taesung Medical Group with the focused composure that had become her professional signature. And Choi Tae-yoon looked at her differently now, in the way that things look different once you had stopped pretending not to see them. It was not obvious. He was not a man who did obvious. But she knew the specific quality of his attention by now, had learned to read the frequency of it the way she had learned to read his silences, and what she saw in the days after his mother's hallway was something that had no professional framing left in it at all. He looked at her like she was a fact he had accepted and was now simply living with, fully and without reservation. They did not announce anything. There was nothing to announce, exactly, or rather there was everything to announce, and neither of them was ready to present it to the specific ecosystem of the 38th floor, which had opinions about everything and shared them in the break room with remarkable efficiency. What they had instead was the private version of it, the version that lived in the specific quality of a morning exchange in the corridor, in the coffee that continued to appear with the addition of a small note now, nothing elaborate, just a time or a question or occasionally a single word that managed to communicate something considerably larger than its syllable count suggested. He texted her at 11:37 one night with the words, "Are you awake?" and she had been awake, reading, and she said yes, and they talked until 2 in the morning about things that had nothing to do with medicine or hospital administration or any of the frameworks that had contained their interactions before. He told her about Seoul in the winter of his childhood, about the specific silence of snowfall on the city that he had loved as a boy before he became someone for whom silence was a working condition rather than a gift. She told him about the market near her mother's house in Enugu, about the way the late afternoon light turned everything amber and golden, and how she had tried to describe it to people who had never been there and found that some things did not translate. Some things do not need to translate, he said. They just need to be witnessed. She held that thought for a long time after they said good night. The complication arrived, as complications always did, from a direction that had been visible on the horizon for some time and that she had been watching with the careful attention of someone who knew that visible threats were not the same as managed ones. His name was Chairman Yu Byung-chul, and he was 71 years old and one of the founding shareholders of Taesung Medical Group, and a man who had, in the words of the senior administrator who briefed Adaeze on the relevant history with the resigned tone of someone recounting weather that had been bad for a long time, never once in 30 years accepted that Choi Tae-yoon's decisions about his own company were final. She became relevant to Chairman Yu on a Monday morning when she arrived at work to find that someone had photographed her and Choi Tae-yoon leaving his mother's residence together at 1:30 in the morning 3 weeks prior. The photograph was not intimate. They were simply walking to their respective cars through the residential gate. But the context was sufficiently clear to a person looking for it, and Chairman Yu was very much a person looking for it, and by 9 in the morning the photograph had been circulated among the board members with a message that framed Adaeze's presence in the director's life as a liability the company could not afford. She found out because Nurse Han told her, with the directness of a woman who respected her enough to deliver bad news without softening it, that there was a board-level conversation happening and that Adaeze's continued position on the exchange program was one of the items under discussion. Adaeze received this information standing at the nurse's station with her morning charts in her hand and her expression entirely composed, because she had been managing bad news her entire life and she was not going to let this one reorganize her face. She finished her shift. She did her job. She was excellent at it, as she always was. That evening she sat in her apartment with her plants and her warm string lights and thought clearly and honestly about what she wanted and what she was willing to do to protect it. She had not built this life, this specific careful life, in a foreign city, to have it dismantled by a 71-year-old man's opinion of who the director of Taesung Medical Group was allowed to spend time with. She had also not survived nursing school on 2 jobs and an international licensing exam and 8 months in a country where she did not speak the primary language to be frightened off by a photograph and a boardroom conversation. But she also knew that Choi Tae-yoon would find out. And she knew, with the precision of someone who had been paying close attention to him for weeks, that when he found out his instinct would be to manage it, to handle it, to make decisions about her situation with the efficiency and authority he brought to every other problem, and to present her with the solution rather than including her in the process. She called him before he could call her. He answered on the second ring. She told him what she knew, completely and in the order it had occurred, and then she said, "Before you say anything, I want you to hear me. I'm not frightened. I'm not leaving. And whatever you are about to decide about how to handle this, I need you to decide it with me, not for me." A silence. Then he said, "I was going to call you in approximately 4 minutes. "I know," she said. Another silence, and in it she could hear him recalibrating, the specific internal work of a man adjusting an instinct he had operated on for 15 years. "Tell me what you want to do," he said finally. She told him. The meeting with Chairman Yu happened 2 days later in the boardroom on the 44th floor, which was the kind of room that had been designed to remind everyone in it of the specific weight of institutional power. Adaeze sat at the table because Choi Tae-yoon had asked her to, and she sat with the posture of someone who had been invited rather than summoned and intended the distinction to be visible. Chairman Yu was a compact man with the bearing of someone who had spent 7 decades being important and had organized his personality around that fact. He looked at Adaeze across the boardroom table with the assessing expression of a man who had expected his presence to communicate something that her presence was apparently failing to receive. She met his gaze with the steadiness she brought to all eye contact and waited. The conversation that followed was conducted primarily between Chairman Yu and Choi Tae-yoon, in Korean that moved faster than Adaeze could entirely follow, but she caught enough of it, and she watched Choi Tae-yoon's face throughout, which was in many ways more informative than the words. He was absolutely controlled. He was also absolutely immovable, in the specific way of something that had decided not to move rather than something that was being held in place. There was no flexibility in him on any of the chairman's points, no negotiation, no management of the older man's position. When the chairman finally directed a question at Adaeze directly, in careful English, asking whether she understood the position her presence created for the organization, she said, with complete pleasantness, "I understand the position my competence creates for the organization, which is that you have an exceptionally well-qualified nurse on your most important clinical floor, and any conversation about removing her is a conversation about lowering your standard of patient care." The boardroom was very quiet. Choi Tae-yoon to his left did not move. But she saw his hand on the table become very slightly still in the way that she had learned meant he was containing something. Chairman Yu looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Choi Tae-yoon with the expression of a man reassessing a situation. The meeting ended without resolution, which in boardroom terms meant that the conversation would continue elsewhere, but that the immediate threat had not materialized into anything actionable. Adaeze walked out of the 44th floor and down to the 38th and went back to her patients, because the afternoon was not over and Mr. Beck needed his dressing changed and the world did not stop requiring care while boardrooms had opinions about things. Choi Tae-yoon found her in the break room an hour later. He came in and sat down across from her without asking and looked at her with an expression that was fully the unguarded one. No professional layer, just him. "You were extraordinary in there," he said. "I was honest," she said. "I find it is usually the same thing in the right circumstances." He looked at her for a moment longer than the sentence required. Then he said, "Chairman Yu is going to continue pushing. He has done it with every decision I have made that he disagreed with for 12 years. I have not lost one yet." "I know," she said. "But this is different," he said, and his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before. Not the controlled evenness of professional communication but something that was rougher and more real underneath it. "Because the other decisions were about the company. This one is about you. And I find that I am not able to approach it with the same detachment." She looked at him across the small table in the institutional break room with its overhead lighting and its vending machine and its completely unromantic practicality, and she thought that this was exactly where she had wanted to be, not somewhere grand or curated but here in the real version of things with the real version of him. "I'm not asking you to be detached," she said. "I'm asking you to be honest with me and make decisions with me. That is all I have ever asked." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and the gesture was so simple and so deliberate that it was more intimate than anything more elaborate could have been. "I'm trying," he said. "I know," she said. "I can see the trying. That is why I am still here." The danger escalated 3 weeks later from the boardroom variety to something considerably more concrete. She was walking to her car in the hospital's parking structure on a Wednesday evening, later than usual because she had stayed to complete documentation on a complex case, when she became aware of 2 men she did not recognize standing near her car in a way that was not accidental. She stopped walking before she was close enough that stopping would be visible and assessed the situation with the rapid clinical clarity she applied to emergencies. She took out her phone and called Choi Tae-yoon. He answered on the first ring. She described what she was seeing in the specific, factual language of someone reporting observable data. She gave him her location and the details she had noted and she kept her voice even because panic was not useful and she had decided not to produce it. "Do not approach your car," he said. "Go back inside the building to the security desk." "I am coming." She went back inside. She sat at the security desk with the overnight guard and she was calm and she answered his concerned questions about whether she needed anything with the polite directness that was simply how she operated, and she waited. He was there in 11 minutes. He came through the hospital entrance with two people she recognized from the background of various professional events as part of his personal security, and he crossed the lobby to where she was sitting, and he looked at her with an expression that was so compressed and so focused that she understood immediately that he had been far more frightened than his voice on the phone had communicated. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face with the specific attention of someone confirming something. "You're all right," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "I did not approach them. I came inside." He exhaled, a single controlled breath that communicated more than the exhale of a man who had simply been concerned about a staff member. His security team dealt with the parking structure. The two men, it emerged, were connected to a company that had business interests in direct competition with Taesung Medical Group's upcoming acquisition, and their presence near her car was what Choi Tae-yoon's security director described as a message, the kind of message that did not involve direct action but was intended to communicate awareness of a vulnerability. The vulnerability was her. She understood this completely, and she sat in Choi Tae-yoon's office on the 44th floor while his security team briefed him, and she thought about all of it with the honest clarity she brought to things that required honest clarity. She was in a foreign country. She was building a life here. She had walked into something that was larger than she had fully calculated, not because he had misled her but because some things could not be fully calculated in advance, and she had always known that. The security team left. They were alone. He was standing at the window with his back to her and his hands in his pockets and the city below throwing its light up against the glass, and she looked at the line of his shoulders, the specific quality of his stillness, and she recognized what she was looking at. A man who was blaming himself. Who was running the calculation of what his life had cost her and finding the number unacceptable. She stood up and walked to the window and stood beside him. "Do not do that," she said. He turned to look at her. "Whatever you are calculating right now," she said. "Whatever version of this you are building where you decide that the right thing to do is to create distance between us to protect me. Do not do that." His jaw was tight. "You were just threatened because of me. I was inconvenienced because of your business rivals," she said. "That is not the same thing. I'm not fragile, Tae-yoon. I did not come to Seoul and build a life here and walk into everything I have walked into because I needed things to be safe. I came because I was brave enough to try." She held his eyes. "Do not take that away from me by deciding I need to be protected from my own choices." Something moved through his face that was slow and deep and arrived like a tide rather than a wave. He turned from the window to face her fully, and she turned to face him, and the city was behind them and the office was quiet, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the hallway outside his mother's room, with everything present and nothing withheld. "I have spent 15 years," he said quietly, "making sure that nothing and no one could be used against me. It required a specific kind of life. A very contained one." He paused. "And then you walked onto my floor and told me I was wrong, and every calculation I had been running for 15 years started producing different results." She looked up at him. "I do not know how to love someone without wanting to put them somewhere nothing can reach them," he said. "I understand that this is not what you want. I'm trying to learn a different way. But you need to know that the wanting to protect you, it is not about thinking you are weak. It is about you being the thing I cannot afford to lose." The words landed in her chest and stayed there. She reached up and put her hand against his face, her palm against his jaw, and felt him go still in the specific way he went still when she touched him, the complete and focused stillness of a man experiencing something he had not had enough practice receiving. "You are not going to lose me," she said. "Not to your rivals and not to your boardroom and not to your instinct to manage everything into safety. But you have to let me stand beside you. Not behind you. Not somewhere protected. Beside you." He covered her hand with his, holding it against his face. "Beside me," he said like he was learning the shape of the phrase. "Beside you," she confirmed. He kissed her with the thoroughness of a man who had stopped being careful, and she kissed him back with everything she had, and outside the 44th floor window Seoul blazed and pulsed with its indifferent magnificent light. The weeks that followed were a reckoning of several kinds simultaneously. The Chairman Yu situation was resolved in the way that situations involving Choi Tae-yoon tended to resolve, completely and in his favor, through a combination of legal precision and the specific leverage that came from knowing every detail of a situation better than any opponent. The acquisition that had made Taesung Medical Group a target proceeded on schedule. The business rivals who had sent men to stand near her car were addressed through channels she did not ask to know the details of and was not offered them. The photograph circulated among the board members was countered by a formal statement from the director's office regarding the high standard of the International Nursing Exchange Program and the exceptional performance of its current participant, which was so carefully worded and so completely professional that it said nothing and communicated everything. The floor noticed. The floor had always noticed. But what the floor noticed now was different from what it had noticed before, not threat or tension or the navigating of something uncertain, but the specific quality of two people who had stopped pretending that what existed between them was something other than what it was. Nurse Han stopped her in the corridor one morning and looked at her with the precise evaluating expression she had worn on Adaeze's first day, and then she said, simply, "He is better when you are here." And then she walked away, which was the most complete thing she could have said, and she clearly knew it. Mr. Beck, when she told him during his final pre-discharge assessment that she hoped he would take care of himself, patted her hand and said, in the careful English he had been practicing specifically for conversations with her, the man finally figured it out. He was taking too long. She laughed all the way back to the nurse's station. His mother recovered fully over the following month, with the meticulous care of an adjusted treatment plan and the additional benefit of a son who was now receiving accurate information about her condition and responding to it accordingly. Choi Yunja greeted Adaeze's weekly visits with the warm satisfaction of a woman whose plan had proceeded exactly as intended, and occasionally said things that were not quite subtle about the general advisability of people who were good for each other finding their way toward permanence. Adaeze received these observations with the pleasantness of someone who was not ready to have the conversation they were designed to initiate, and Choi Yunja received this in turn with the patience of a woman who had been waiting for her son to do something sensible for 39 years and was capable of waiting a little longer. The night everything shifted toward its final shape arrived on a Friday in November, when Seoul had turned cold and clear and the city's lights had the particular brilliant quality they acquired when the air was cold enough to sharpen them. She was in his apartment, which had become a place she inhabited with the comfortable familiarity of somewhere that had gradually made room for her, her spare shoes near the door, her tea in the kitchen cabinet, her book on the side table, the accumulation of small domestic facts that constituted a life being built in proximity to another life. She was reading. He was working at his desk in the way he worked when she was there, with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned that her presence was not a distraction but a context, something that made the work possible rather than interrupting it. He stopped working at 9:10. She looked up from her book. He was looking at her from across the room with an expression she had not seen before, something that was so settled and so certain that it had none of the complexity of his other expressions, none of the layers or the calculation. Just clarity. He got up and crossed the room and sat down beside her on the sofa and took her hands in both of his, and she set her book down because the quality of his attention was complete and she gave him hers in return. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what I want." She waited. "I have spent my entire adult life building things that were permanent," he said. "Infrastructure, institutions, systems that would outlast the people who created them." He looked down at their joined hands and then up at her face. "I have never tried to build something that was alive. Something that required two people and could not be constructed by one." She was very still. He reached into the pocket of the jacket he had draped over the arm of the sofa, because he had apparently been carrying this with him through the evening with the intention of this moment, and he produced a ring that was simple and extraordinary in the way of things chosen with complete attention, a warm gold band with a stone that caught the lamp light and held it, and she looked at it and felt the breath leave her body in a way that was entirely involuntary. "I know that I am not the easiest person," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost, not quite, a smile underneath the gravity of the moment. "I know that building something with me requires a specific kind of patience and a specific kind of courage." He met her eyes and held them. "You have both. You have always had both. You had them before I deserved them." She felt tears arrive in her eyes with the precise timing of emotions that had been held carefully in place for a long time and had finally found their moment. "Adaeze," he said, "I would like to build something alive with you. Something permanent in the way that living things are permanent, not because they cannot be damaged but because they choose to continue." He held the ring between them. "Will you choose to continue with me?" She looked at him, this specific and complicated and entirely real man, with his sharp face and his controlled hands and his 15 years of walls that he had been dismantling brick by careful brick since the morning she had walked onto his floor and told him he was wrong, and she thought about every moment that had led to this one, the coffee without notes and the chocolates from home and the hallway outside his mother's room and the boardroom and the parking structure in the 44th floor window with Seoul blazing behind them, and she thought that every single one of them had been necessary, because they had all been the truth, and she had never wanted anything that was not the truth. "Yes," she said. "Obviously and completely yes." He put the ring on her finger and looked at it there with the focused attention he brought to things that were irreversible, and then he looked at her, and in his eyes was the expression she had been seeing in pieces for months, fully assembled now and entirely undisguised. She leaned forward and kissed him with the complete directness that was simply who she was, and he pulled her close with the thoroughness of a man who had stopped being careful, and outside the apartment window Seoul went on being brilliant and cold and entirely unaware of what was happening in one apartment among its millions. The wedding was in January. He had asked her what she wanted and she had told him honestly, which was something small and real, and he had listened with the complete attention he gave to everything she said and had made it exactly that. 60 people in a private venue near the Han River, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the water and the winter city beyond, and the kind of flowers she had described once in passing, deep burgundy and warm gold, because he remembered everything she said and acted on it in ways that were still surprising her. Her mother had flown from Enugu and arrived with her 3 brothers and a quantity of food that required logistical coordination and opinions about everything that she delivered directly and without editing. She had assessed Choi Tae-yoon on the second day with the focused precision of a woman who had raised Adaeze and understood exactly what to look for. She had observed him watching Adaeze cross a room. She had watched him listen to her speak. She had watched him move through the space of a conversation in a way that oriented toward her without performance or theater, just the simple gravitational fact of a man for whom one person was the primary direction. At the end of the second day, Adeeze's mother had found her daughter alone in the kitchen and said, "In Igbo, that man looks at you like you are the answer to a question he spent 15 years not knowing how to ask." Adeeze had said nothing. Her mother had nodded once with the satisfied expression of a woman who had made an accurate assessment and was at peace with it. At the wedding Adeeze wore a dress that was ivory and simple and draped in a way that was entirely her, with her hair down and natural the way she wore it on the evenings that were fully her own, because this was the fullest version of herself and she wanted to walk into this moment as exactly that. Her brothers sat in the front row and made the particular sounds of people who had been raised in a loud house and had never fully internalized the concept of indoor volume. Choi Yeonja sat 2 seats over from them in a deep jewel-toned dress and wept with the open unguarded feeling of a woman who had been waiting for this and was not going to pretend she hadn't. Choi Tae-yoon stood at the front of the room and watched her walk toward him with an expression on his face that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Not the controlled professional composure and not even the unguarded private version she had learned to read, but something entirely new, something that had never existed in his face before because it had never had occasion to, pure uncalculated joy, quiet and absolute and completely real. She reached him and he took her hands and looked at her and said quietly, just for her before anything formal began, "You are the bravest person I have ever known." She looked up at him and said, "And you are the best one." They said the words that the ceremony required and then they said the ones that were only theirs, and when he kissed her the room made a collective sound that was entirely human and warm and her brothers were the loudest part of it. 6 months later she stood in the bathroom of the home they had built together, a place that held both their lives in the comfortable accumulated way of 2 people who had stopped being careful about the merging, and she looked at the test in her hand and felt the specific quality of a moment that was both completely expected and entirely overwhelming. She walked into the kitchen where he was making coffee in the unhurried way of a Saturday morning person, which was a version of him she had fallen specifically in love with, and she held out the test without any preamble because she had never been a person who buried the lead. He looked at it. He set down the coffee. He looked at her with an expression that traveled through surprise and landed somewhere so vast and undefended that she felt it physically, the full specific weight of Choi Tae-yoon completely undone by something good. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in his hands and looked at her with everything he had spent 15 years protecting and had finally, brick by careful brick, allowed someone to stand inside. "We are going to build something alive," he said, and his voice was rough with it, the realness of it. "We already did," she said, and touched his face and felt him lean into her hand the way he always did, the complete and focused stillness of a man receiving something he had stopped believing he was allowed to have. Outside, Seoul was doing the thing it did in the early summer, warming into its full brilliant self, the river catching the morning light and throwing it back at the sky. Inside, 2 people stood in a kitchen that belonged to both of them, holding a fact that was new and permanent and alive, and the city could have its opinions. This was theirs. And it was more than enough.